Hi, I'm Motoko Rich. I'm the Tokyo Bureau Chief for the New York Times, and I'm here live in Singapore. It's the night of the historic encounter between the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and President Donald Trump of the United States. This was a very anticipated meeting. It was on again, off again, finally back on just 2 weeks ago. So there's a scramble to plan this meeting between Kim Jong-un and President Trump to discuss North Korea's denuclearization and a security guarantee from the United States. This was a very drama-filled day. The drama started a couple of days ago when both Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump landed in Singapore. Their motorcades went through the streets of the city, lots of crowds on the sides of the streets. And then last night, after a day of seclusion, Kim Jong-un finally emerged and went on a little sightseeing tour of Singapore. He showed up on the roof deck of the Marina Bay Sands Hotel, which is owned by a Trump supporter, Sheldon Adelson. He waved to bystanders. He took a selfie with the foreign minister of Singapore. It was quite the charm offensive by Mr. Kim. And then this morning, the day started somewhat predictably with a storm of tweets from President Trump, where he criticized the haters for suggesting that the summit wouldn't go well. He said, "We'll be just fine." And then, quite dramatically, he tweeted out the notice that his economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, had had a heart attack. So it was already very drama-filled before anything had ever happened. It was a day of pageantry. Both Kim Jong-un and President Trump, they're the first American president to meet, he was the first American president to meet North Korean leader. They shook hands in front of a lineup of the North Korean and American flag. It's probably the first time we've seen that official lineup of the two flags together. The U.S. and North Korea don't currently have formal diplomatic relations, so to see the two men appearing as if they were basically equals was quite significant. The body language and a lot of the symbolism still suggested that Mr. Trump had the upper hand as the elder statesman. In Asian culture, age is very important. So Mr. Kim showed respect to Mr. Trump. Even though Trump's motorcade arrived on Sentosa Island, which is a resort island off the southern tip of Singapore where the summit was held, even though Trump's motorcade arrived first, he actually entered the hotel where the summit was held last. And that's a sign of respect and status in Asian culture. The person who comes to the meeting last is the one with the higher status. We got to see them shaking hands, make a few comments, and then walk into a one-on-one meeting where Mr. Kim and Mr. Trump met alone, except for their interpreters, for about 38 minutes to be precise. They then joined a much broader group of advisors on Mr. Trump's side. It included National Security Advisor Bolton, Secretary of State Pompeo, his Chief of Staff John Kelly, and on the other side of the table was Kim Jong-un with some of his advisors, including Kim Yong-chol, who was the vice chairman of the Workers' Party, who had gone to Washington to deliver the letter from Kim Jong-un, which triggered Mr. Trump to say the summit was finally back on. After that, they had a working lunch. And then there were some interesting moments where Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim went for a little bit of a walk. Mr. Trump showed Mr. Kim the so-called Beast, the Cadillac limousine, and for a moment it almost looked like Mr. Kim was going to climb right in it. And then there was sort of a confused moment along the breezeway where it seemed like they didn't even know where they were supposed to go. Trump promised everybody they were going to be signing something. It took about 15-20 minutes before the two entered side by side through a joint door, again, sort of showing that they're kind of like equals, and went to sign a document. It was a very vague and general document that said that the North Korea was committed to working towards complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which suggests that North Korea also wants the United States to remove its troops from the peninsula. The president surprised everyone at a media briefing where he later, in answer to a question, said that the United States would stop joint military exercises with South Korea. Later on, United States Forces Korea put out a statement saying that they had not received any guidance that they were supposed to stop their military exercises. So there seemed to be a lot of confused messages. Mr. Trump also showed a quite extraordinary video. He said that he showed it on an iPad to Mr. Kim and his advisors. It was kind of like a Hollywood trailer that seemed to show two paths for the North Korea, either something with prosperity. There were images of kind of explosions and fighter jets taking off from aircraft carriers, juxtaposed against more cheery images of children smiling and sun rising over skyscrapers and auto factories and even artisanal pizza and shopping centers. So it was a very interesting day, but let's go to your questions. I really appreciate everybody watching and asking some questions. We've got a question from Sergey Enriquez who says, how can you regulate the production of weapons in the United States? Who regulates or controls a country? Well, I don't really know the answer to that question when you mean how can you regulate the production of weapons in the United States. If you're talking about nuclear weapons, it's controlled very tightly by the federal government, the Department of Energy. Samgamani Narayan Swami says it was a hype, no major decision on peace process. Why? Well, from the get-go, it was always going to be difficult for there to be any kind of specific outcome from this summit. The advisors to the two leaders were working up until the last minute, even as they were headed over to the island to kind of hammer out a joint statement. And when they began, North Korea and the United States were very far apart on their definition of denuclearization. The United States had made very clear that what they meant was they really want North Korea to entirely get rid of its nuclear weapons and its capability to produce new ones in the future. They call it complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of their nuclear program. The North, on the other hand, has talked more vaguely about complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. Since the peninsula is divided into North and South Korea, and the United States has a military presence of about 30,000 troops in South Korea, North Korea has typically meant, when they use that phrase, complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, that they would give up their nuclear program when the United States pulls its troops and stops protecting South Korea with its own nuclear weapons. So this is a very complicated and long-standing negotiation, and many prior administrations have tried this, have come close, have had agreements where the North has agreed to denuclearize and then at some point has reneged on the deal and gone back to developing their arsenal, to the point where last year they test-launched an ICBM, which could potentially reach the continental United States, and also tested a bomb that was many times more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that ended the World War II. More questions. Don't you think Kim's main agenda should have been twofold, getting security guarantees from the United States and secondly, better economic relations between the two nations? We think that probably was Kim Jong-un's agenda. The declaration that was signed at the end of the summit also provided sort of a vague sense of a security guarantee for the North, but we again don't quite know what that means. In his media briefing, the president talked about stopping the military exercises or war games that are conducted by both the United States troops and the South Korean troops a couple of times a year in South Korea. Also, the made vague promises that there could be economic prosperity, investment, particularly from South Korea and Japan, if the North were to get rid of its nuclear weapons. Another question was, how much of the cost of this meeting and who paid for that? Well, the Singaporean government has said they paid about $20 million. They haven't said exactly what has been covered by that. There was talk before the summit that the North was trying to get the United States government to pay for the hotel bill for Kim Jong-un and his delegation. He stayed at a very fancy hotel, the St. Regis in downtown Singapore. But we don't know if the United States government paid for that. For that matter, we don't know if the Singapore government paid for that. When they talked about the $20 million, they didn't say exactly what it covered. Presumably, there are a lot of things that it covered, including blockades for the roads, massive extra police presence for several days. There were about 5,000 police officers and emergency responders on the streets guarding the hotels where both leaders stayed, blocking off the roads. There was also a massive media center that was set up to host about 2,500 to 3,000 journalists who came in from around the world to cover this summit. So that was what the cost that was stated by the Singaporean government. What do you think the state of this relationship will be in 1 to 3 to 6 months? Well, to quote the president, we'll see. He said that he could tell within the first 5 seconds of meeting Mr. Kim that he thought that the North Korean leader wanted a deal. But he also made a statement during his media briefing that he said if 6 months from now it doesn't turn out that way, then he said, well, I probably won't admit that I'm wrong, but I'll probably make up some excuse. So we don't know. There's great hope that the relationship is on a more calm footing, because last year in 2017, it was very hostile with a lot of rhetoric going back and forth between the two leaders, Trump calling for fire and fury to rain down on North Korea, Kim Jong-un calling President Trump a mentally deranged dotard, and also threatening all kinds of retaliation and violence against both the United States and Japan, its key ally in Asia. So we do hope that this summit is at the very least the beginning of a much calmer relationship, after which the chief diplomats and negotiators will have to go in and hammer out the nitty-gritty details. Another question, does it mean people can go to North Korea now as tourists safely? I will have to find out if the State Department is planning to lift its advisory to American citizens not to travel there. As you may remember, just about a year ago, University of Virginia honor student Otto Warmbier, after 17 months of captivity, was released from North Korea in a coma and died a few days later. And after that incident, the State Department recommended that Americans not travel to North Korea. North Korea just recently released 3 more American hostages and sent them back to the United States. But again, we don't know how safe it is for tourists to go to the north. Cynthia Stanish asks, whether the terms of this agreement, what have we promised? We have, like I said, some vague security guarantees and agreement to move towards peace and stability in the region if the North commits to and implements denuclearization, but there are very few details in this document. So a lot of people were unsatisfied by it because it doesn't seem to really present anything new beyond what has been said multiple times before in previous negotiations between the United States and North Korea, or for that matter, in multilateral negotiations between North Korea and the United States, China, Japan, Russia. So it is definitely a very vague statement, and in as much as there are details, they will have to come from here on out. Okay, if you have any comments or questions, please post them in the comment box. If you've just joined, I'm Motoko Rich, the Tokyo Bureau Chief with the New York Times, here live in Singapore late in the evening after a historic day where the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, met Mr. Donald Trump, the first American president to meet a North Korean leader. Let's see, some other questions. Who will monitor nuclear disarmament if the U.S. withdraws troops from South Korea? Well, although nobody is talking about withdrawing troops, the most that President Trump said today was that there may be a cessation of the military exercises, although the United States Forces Korea put out a statement saying they've had no such guidance that they're stopping what are war games that are conducted twice a year in South Korea. Nobody has talked about withdrawing troops. But if the question of who will monitor nuclear dismantlement is a very important one. And before the summit, there was constant talk by the American side that what was needed was complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of the North's nuclear program. And when they say verifiable, they mean that independent trained experts should be allowed into the country to inspect the nuclear sites and make sure that the North is in fact dismantling its nuclear program and getting rid of its nuclear fissile material so that it can't go back and make new weapons all over again. Another question, is it true that Trump just said the U.S. will stop military exercises? Yes, during a media briefing it appeared that that's what he said, but there's a lot of confusion right now because the United States Forces Korea, which represents the 30,000 troops, U.S. troops that are based on bases in South Korea, put out a statement this evening saying that they had not received any guidance that the military exercises were off and that they were planning to continue in their current military posture until they received further guidance. So we're not quite sure what is happening on that point. What was the reaction to the summit in Singapore? Well, I was out on the streets earlier this week, and there were quite a lot of bystanders who were very curious to see Kim Jong-un and President Trump. There were a lot of people that stood on the bridge as the motorcade went to and from the resort island of Sentosa, where the summit was actually held. I think there was quite a bit of curiosity. The government of Singapore was absolutely thrilled to have the summit here because all eyes of the international media have been on Singapore for the last 3 days. The tourism board was heavily promoting Singapore. They even put out an advisory to a lot of the office buildings and tenants around the area where the media is staying and where the summit was held, suggesting that they all keep their lights on all night from June 10th through the 13th because they wanted everyone to be able to see the quote-unquote beautiful skyline of Singapore. So this has been a big deal for Singapore. Let's see. Do you think Kim wants to change the culture of his country? Well, we do think that Kim Jong-un is young. He's very different from his father and his grandfather, and he has indicated that he wants to change the economy of his country. He's already allowed some market forces to take place so people can develop some entrepreneurial businesses, sell on the open marketplace. So there have been some gradual changes in the country, but it's not clear that he's done anything to change. It's fairly clear, actually, that he has not done anything to change the authoritarian leadership and the very tight grip that he holds on the country and its media. People are not allowed to know that much about what is going on. Quite surprisingly, with this summit, the state media put out information. They let the public know that Kim Jong-un had landed in Singapore, that he had been greeted by the foreign minister. They put out a lot of pictures of his nighttime stroll through the streets of Singapore last night. We're waiting to see what they say about the actual summit meeting. But typically, the media is very controlled, and the public is not told very much other than what the regime wants them to know propaganda-wise. Okay, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. It's Motoko Rich. I'm the Tokyo Bureau Chief with the New York Times, here live in Singapore after the historic summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. Thank you so much, and come back and see us again sometime.